Hello and welcome to this morning's talk at 10. In yesterday's webcast, we talked about some of the challenges faced when adapting to remote working. Today, we look at the impact on the food industry, an essential sector which must continue to operate despite the pandemic, and where the majority of workers can't work from home if they're to help keep London and the nation fed. So let's get down to business. Park Royal, in the heart of northwest London, is the UK's most successful industrial estate, home to several hundred food businesses. My expert panel this morning know the estate and its food sector intimately. They are Barbara Bray MBE, Associate Consultant at Food Safety Consultants Techni-K, Wilda Haddad, Project Director at Dina Foods, one of the UK's leading artisan producers of specialist Mediterranean foods based in Park Royal, and Ian Wright CBE, CEO of the Food and Drink Federation. Ian worked at Diageo in Park Royal for many years before joining the FDF. And we have my colleague Pim monitoring your questions on YouTube, so please don't be shy in sharing your thoughts and queries with us. Today's Talk at 10 webcast is possible due to the kind support of Better Futures, the Mayor of London's flagship programme to create a clean tech cluster in London, funded by ERDF. And a reminder, as always, visit our online hub for links to resources on managing the impact of coronavirus in your business. Within sector-specific advice, we have a growing resource on the manufacture of food products amid the coronavirus outbreak, and particularly picking up on some of the excellent resources from Techni-K. Now, our themes this morning will be exploring the impact of coronavirus on food businesses in Park Royal and beyond. Then discussing the effectiveness of government support measures, as well as approaches to optimising production with limited resources. And finally, we'll explore safety measures as well as supply chains. So, to kick us off and to help us reflect on, I suppose, the wider context of the impact of coronavirus on the food sector in Park Royal and beyond, I'm going to invite each panellist to share the reflections. I'm going to turn to Barbara first of all, then Ian, I hope, to share your thoughts, Barbara, on from all the conversations that you undoubtedly have been having over the past few weeks with different businesses about what you're hearing right now on the ground. Barbara.
Hello and good morning. It certainly is a time that we never expected to find ourselves in, and businesses have been getting in touch with Techni-K on a daily basis to ask lots of questions. Because really, we're in what's called a VUCA period. It's a term that was coined by the American military after the Cold War, which means volatile, unpredictable, complex and ambiguous. And this is about decision making that has to be based on facts, but also be adaptable to changing information. I think where the food industry is at, because a lot of people have got certification to BRC or SALSA or various other retail standards, people have got systems in place, they've got very good control of hygiene, but the communication is where we need to be better. So, for example, speaking to workers about things like social distancing, sickness pay, how you're going to work, all these types of things have to be communicated, not just because it's what the government guidance expects us to do, but it's also because people need to feel reassured. And at the moment, everybody's looking for certainty. But like I said earlier, in a VUCA period, you don't necessarily have certainty because things are unpredictable. So the better the communication is to the workforce, the more smoothly things will roll.
That point around the criticality of communication, Barbara, kind of keeps coming through in all the conversations we've been having over the past few weeks on this programme. Communication almost sort of number one issue for employers. But I cut you off, so carry on.
Definitely. So moving on from communication, the communication around the cleaning, so the hand hygiene, factories had it in there anyway, but it's about making sure people understand the importance of that and not trying to bring in their own take on it. I've heard stories of people bringing extra gloves into work, extra masks. That's just not necessary. So again, the communication is key to stop people from trying to think that what they've got isn't sufficient. But also factory hygiene. Now's not the time to cut corners. And I think when people are worried about their stocks of cleaning chemicals, they still need to maintain a high level cleaning and the good quality of cleaning that they've got in place. Which brings me nicely on to my last point, which is collaboration. So in the first few days, everyone was just doing their own thing, running around and trying to source what they could. But what we're starting to see now is groups springing up where people are collaborating to share information, but also talk about what they can do to help each other. So if somebody's waiting on a delivery, how they help each other out. I think we kind of had that before this all started, where people would often cover orders for somebody else. But I think now that we really are in a problem, everybody's looking to see how they can start to work together better. And I do think we need to pull on organisations like the FDF, which Ian represents, to help everybody do that a bit more consistently as we move through the next few weeks.
It's been fantastic, Barbara, sort of seeing that level of collaboration start to take hold across so many sectors over the past few weeks as people have sort of risen to the new challenges presented. Now, I'm hoping that Ian's audio link has been holding up, because I'm really keen to get his perspective from the FDF on the sort of the wider landscape. Ian.
For inviting me. My apologies for not being there visually, but I'm not sure that you're particularly disadvantaged by that. Certainly my colleagues would like it if that was the case. And it's slightly annoying because as you can see from the picture, I even put a jacket on for you for the first time in 2 weeks. I first of all would say that this is obviously a very, just to echo what's already been said and is being said all the time, I think, it's a very, very scary time. And one of the things that it's absolutely clear, I completely agree that transparency and consistency of communication are utterly crucial in this time. And one of the things that has been, and is getting better, I think, has been that the government has been pretty clear about what it wants, but not necessarily consistently clear. So we've seen a couple of fairly significant moves in different directions, mostly to more than a week ago. I think for the last week, since the Prime Minister's 8:30 Monday night address, we've had a consistency of direction. And I think that's been very helpful, and it has contributed to the fact that this lockdown has so far been very effective. Now we're seeing one or two issues cropping up now that drink workers are clearly designated as key workers. Just to deal with a couple of the issues that we have. One is, understandably, those at work who are working in factories are anxious, or many of them are anxious about the circumstances in which they're working. So it's absolutely vital that we keep the right rules in place for running factories and distribution centres and warehouses. And some of those rules are quite difficult for food and drink companies, particularly smaller ones where the workplace might not be designed in a way that allows particularly effective social distancing. I understand that Public Health England are going to publish new guidelines on this today or tomorrow, and they will, I think, give some reassurance to those working in those situations about the way in which they should be socially distancing in factories, warehouses, distribution centres, and also the protective gear they need. Somewhat to my surprise, I must admit, it seems that in most situations, Public Health England think that masks are not an essential. They are essential in social care positions and in NHS positions, situations, because of the possibility of transmission through people who are poorly transmitting the virus. But the risk in factory and other work situations appears to be significantly lower. Now, what the trouble with that is that doesn't mean that people feel safer. And they may well want masks. And one of the issues that we're facing is, can we find suppliers of masks over the next few days, next few weeks, that will assuage that particular psychological rather than medical concern. Second concern is transport to work. I know a lot of people have to take public transport, which can be quite intimidating in terms of social distancing, or they want to share cars, and there's something slightly counterintuitive about car sharing on the way to work. It is not necessary to put Harry in the boot in order to make it safe, but it is important that we follow guidelines, and I'm told that PHE will also be issuing guidelines on car sharing today, and that will also, I think, be welcome. And you might say, finally, that this is all a bit late. Well, I think we are in an unprecedented situation. We are playing catch up with the concerns of our workers, and often these concerns emerge unexpectedly. So, for example, my last point is that the concern about intervention by the police has arisen completely unexpectedly. Now, I don't know what the situation is like in West London, but in some parts of more of England, particularly up in the north, we've heard a lot of stories of police intervening, stopping people sharing cars and asking what they're doing. Actually, even as far as going into factories and trying to tell the people running the factories that their product is not essential and they should close down. Well, that is not that is not the responsibility of the police. The fact is that all food and drink factories should be working or can work, and we've had to spend 2 or 3 days in the last week getting new guidance out to chief police officers and then into the forces to make this happen. And that is why we are playing catch up. Some of these issues arise totally unexpectedly, and we have to deal with them quickly. But we're here to help, and if after this program any of your viewers wants to know more about any particular aspect of how they should be managing their businesses in order to be compliant, or if they want any other advice on furloughing or on loans or any finance issues, our website and our colleagues are here to help, and that is the role of the FDF and the other trade associations through this crisis.
Thank you, Ian. Some really interesting reflections there, and it reminds me how I think for some weeks in France they've had a system whereby folk can sort of print off a sort of sheet of paper where I think my impression is tick boxes to say why it is you're out and about. Has there been any talk at a national level that you've picked up on of any sort of similar approach in the UK for essential workers?
Well, certainly food workers can go on either the FDF or the DEFRA website and print off a letter which gives them, or which they carry with their own identification for their place to work, which allows them to go to work. And we've only so far had, one of the letters is actually hilariously from me, but one of them is from George Eustace, the Secretary of State. If you carry those letters with personal ID, your pass card for work or whatever, so far we've only had one example of a police officer stopping someone with one of those letters, and we had a subsequent apology for that when we followed it up. So I think the message has got through to the police forces that these letters from food organisations and the ministry are sufficient to allow those people to go to work.
That's really helpful to know, and something I think we'll be proactively making sure all of our Park Royal food businesses have got access to off the back of this webcast. Now, for a sort of coalface perspective, I'm pleased to be able to bring in Wilda from Dina Foods to share a little bit about what the impact has been for your firm and how you've been adapting over the past few weeks. Wilda.
Drew.
Morning.
As our previous two panelists have highlighted, this is a wholly unprecedented time, and I think it's probably fair to say that no crisis management procedure could have really fully encompassed the situation that we find ourselves in now. And I think it's become apparent that we've had to adapt our procedure quite significantly over the last few weeks and review it with each sort of day, essentially, to adapt our business model. By way of background, Dina Foods has sort of 3 separate factories. The bakery, we produce a number of flatbreads, we have the savoury kitchen, and then we have the confectionery factory. The business that's been impacted the most is the food service industry. We've seen the drop-off of orders for that department. And as a result, there's been a downturn in that category. However, the supply of bread, as you know, is a staple product. So in the last 2 weeks, we saw a surge of the orders that have come through. And we've had to adapt our sort of staffing operation accordingly. And with the government's advice, we have asked a number of our office staff to work from home. However, the reality is we are operations. We need to produce food to put onto the shelves of these supermarkets. So we've had to adapt our product lines to meet the demand of the supermarkets, and we've consolidated the lines so we can do that. So instead of having, for example, 20 products going out, we've got a limited selection, and that facilitates the production for us. And as a result, then we've adjusted our shift patterns. Instead of working essentially 24 hours over 3 shifts, we've consolidated it over 2 shifts. And that means we've had a pool of staff. And we've taken the advice given by Techni-K, which is to create rotas. So, you have one shift on, and then there's another shift that is sort of as the backup, essentially. If people are getting sick, then you pull the next person in from that pool of staff. So we've got that contingency in place. However, there's no denying that our workers are genuinely very scared about what's happening. So we've also seen an uprise in staff phoning in saying, we just don't want to come into work. And that's something we're having to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Fortunately, we've still got a pool of staff that we can still rely on to make sure that we are meeting the orders. But I imagine as the days go by, that it's going to get more challenging for us. And in terms of impact on the business, it will have a long-term impact on us. And for example, we had a number of launches planned for the coming months. They're all completely on hold now. And I know retailers have had to adapt their launches accordingly as well. We've had to put on hold all new product development, and exhibitions that we're supposed to be participating in the coming months have also been cancelled as a result. So there's no denying that this is going to have a long-term effect on the business, and in terms of meeting targets and the forecasts that we'd set ourselves for 2020. I think Barbara mentioned earlier that auditing as well, we are BRC accredited, IFS accredited, and we had unannounced audits booked for this year. We've already heard from BRC that essentially will not be taking place, and it will have an impact on our business in the long term. I mean, they can be rescheduled, but our priority now is to secure the certifications we've got. So we're in the process of doing that through extensions via risk assessments. And that's the reality of it. However, there is one positive out of this all, which is seeing the staff step up and take on new roles and adapt really well to the situation. And for that, we are grateful. We've got about 150 staff members, and it's so reassuring to see the resilience and positivity of those staff members that have been able to step up and cover roles for individuals who are very senior in the business and had to take a step back because they are in the high risk category. And for that, we are grateful, and it reinforces that the sort of the resilience of the organization and the people that we have within it.
I'm glad you were able to end on a positive there for us, Wilda. But no, I think really important point, and as you say, lovely to see in so many businesses that resilience and adaptability shining through in so many people. I think you've all three helped give us a brilliant sort of overview and sense of the context that we're currently sort of grappling with. But I think perhaps now if we move across to the sort of the question of the effectiveness of government support measures, as Ian acknowledged, clearly this is a fast-moving context, and folk are working very long hours in Whitehall to try and make sure solutions are put in place. But that doesn't mean that there isn't always room for improvement. So I wonder, Ian, whether you can share some of your sort of reflections on how helpful the financial support measures offered will be for food businesses.
Well, I think the measures offered are unprecedented and extraordinary. Indeed, one of my colleagues, quite a senior food industry manager, described them as astonishing. And they are that. They are really remarkable. The loans, the scale of the loans, the furloughing program, the way in which lots and lots of regulation has been lifted, particularly the competition regulation, to allow companies to collaborate in the national interest. These are all major concessions. I mean, in brackets, I just note a question asked by Mark Littlewood of the Institute of Economic Affairs in a piece he wrote at the weekend, where he said, if all these regulations need to be lifted in a moment of national crisis, we really do need to ask how many of them need to be there when we go back to business as normal. And I think that is a good challenge, but it's one for later. On the financial health, I think the issue is that it is that the government has conceived these brilliant notions, and they are impressive, but the detail has taken ages to work out. And I would say that is my main concern about government more generally. So I do a morning call with about 20 or 30 food industry, big companies, distribution, manufacturers, retailers. And I do a daily call with George Eustace, the DEFRA minister, and a couple of times a week with various other ministers. And what happens is we surface concerns. We say this isn't working, or we don't know enough about that, or can you help with this? And the minister's very keen, or the senior officials very keen to say, yes, they take note of the problem. And then it takes days, and in some cases weeks, to come back with an answer. So today, for the first time, we've been asking since the furloughed worker scheme was announced 2 weeks ago for detail about whether a worker furloughed could go and work for another organisation and still be in receipt of the furloughed part of their payment. So the company A employs you or me, we're furloughed, we get 80% of our salary from company A. Can we go and work for company B and receive a salary from them as well as receiving the salary from company A? Now, I understand why that's complicated, because it involves all sorts of tax issues, but it's taken 12 days to get the answer yes, when it was blindingly obvious at the start that it would have to be yes, otherwise the scheme would be pointless in order for it to get workers moving around. And that is the concern, I think, if there is one. It is the delay, and I think that is kind of inevitable, and I don't criticise government for it. But in the and the same is true with the loan scheme. The problem with the loan scheme is that it first of all requires an onerous process with banks. Secondly, it encourages businesses which may already be quite indebted to take on more debt. And I would have preferred to see government offering the option of taking equity, which is what I think they're going to do in the States. I think that's what happened in 2008 in the States. The government took equity, and that actually proved very successful in most cases. And it means the company doesn't end up indebted. And I wish we could think about that a bit more. And the other problem is there's a big hole in the middle between the companies worth up to £45 million turnover and those with over £1 billion turnover. I think that's going to be plugged today. I think Rishi Sunak is going to make an announcement today or tomorrow to say that one or other scheme will operate across the board. And I think the government's clocked that, and that's good. But while I think the schemes are excellent, I think they are quite difficult to work. And certainly a lot of our focus over the last week has been trying to get some level of clarity on how we can make them work better. And as a consequence, what we're going to do over the next 2 or 3 weeks is assign 3 or 4 of our team to literally call every member and check whether they want to access these schemes, and if so, to try and offer them help to do so.
I think really interesting reflections here, and I think where we're picking up from our members a number of concerns is, I suppose, businesses that sort of fall through the cracks in these government schemes. So I think the furloughing system clearly works very well for a hospitality or retail business, that's perhaps furloughing 98% of their staff and just sort of treading water and keeping a holding operation. But actually, if you're a business that is seeing a significant downturn in trade and turnover, but you need to keep working through this crisis, actually it can be harder to fit the furloughing model. It may be that if you've got a staff team of 10, you can't make you need to kind of keep a broad base of capabilities, so you don't necessarily want to take 3 or 4 people out of the business because it's then rather difficult to keep operating.
Oh, and I think that's absolutely right, and also it's invidious, isn't it? So you get to the point where in a business of 10 or 20 people, where you make that choice, and the 2, 3, 4 people who have been furloughed, where a choice has been made, will inevitably feel some level of discontent, and may well over time find that really rather unpleasant. And the question of what happens to in those sorts of situations to the people when they return to work is going to be one that we all need to pay attention to, which we need to pay attention.
It seems very strange that there isn't the flexibility to 50% furlough someone, for example, so that you can keep everyone engaged.
I think that will come. I think as we get into this, rules which seemed, this is something I observe already happening, rules which seemed important. This is a bit like the Mark Littlewood point I made earlier. Rules which seemed really important a week ago are now completely meaningless. And I think government will get to the point where it realises it intuitively as well as intellectually that this is going to go on for quite a long time. And if it does go on for quite a long time, it needs to be extraordinarily flexible, or the consequence will be that businesses that would otherwise have survived don't.
Indeed, and the other point that sort of comes through in a lot of conversations in Park Royal is of course business rates. That at the moment it's relatively tightly scoped, the relief in terms of sectors, and there can be businesses that are sort of one step removed from food, hospitality, etc. that may not be eligible, but equally that in a London context, the threshold of 51,000 is somewhat meaningless.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's also that's true across the board, that the regional issues haven't really been taken fully into account. It's very difficult to do so, incidentally, but for example, the same is true if you think about it about the furloughed worker wage. That £2,500 is actually a pretty significant amount of money particularly if it's 80% of the salary in large parts of England, Scotland, and Wales. But in London would be seen as quite for those in full-time employment in many places, not on the national minimum living wage, would feel that was quite a low amount. So I think the numbers don't quite work, but it's very difficult for government to try and do something regionally. It really is a major problem. I think, as I say, by the end of next week or the week after, particularly if this begins to look like it's going to move on into July or August, I think you'll see a massive loosening of some of these kind of constrictions on individual rules. I think they'll be desperate to try and do everything even more to keep businesses trading, and even if they're not trading, in hibernation, so that there is something to bring out of afterwards. I mean, there's a piece of work done I saw in the paper this morning that suggests that 1 in 5 UK businesses will run out of cash in the next couple of months. Now, if that's the reason, that's always the reason businesses go bust, of course. But government can do something about that, because government has literally endless access to cash. And we may well need to worry about what we do about how to pay for it afterwards. Because it would be better to have 90% of the businesses in this country capable of being resuscitated and pay for it later than it would be to have 60% of the businesses and feel that we've covered the cost.
Absolutely, and the cost of rebuilding those lost firms is it would be vast. To stay on, I suppose, a sort of fairly practical sort of line of inquiry, I'd be interested to get Wilda's reflections on how it's working for your staff that have got children, and you know whether they're able to access childcare through local authorities. What are you picking up on the ground there, Wilda?
Thank you, Andrew. We have reinforced to all our staff that they fall under the key worker category and they can rely on the schools, if necessary, to have their children looked after there. However, what we've recognised is that because of the fear of this virus, a lot of them would prefer to have the children at home and cared for by someone else. And so they've made the choice to do that. And as a result, what we've also seen, as I mentioned earlier, staff saying, we just don't want to come into work at present because we're just that scared about this virus. And they're mentioning that children are being unwell and what have you. So as an organisation, all we can do is really reinforce what the government is saying. But a lot of them are choosing not to rely on the schools for childcare. And I don't know what their arrangements are at home. They may have family living with them already where they can rely on maybe their partner or grandparents already in the house. But I haven't seen a huge spike in our staff members utilising that facility.
Interesting. And has that featured in conversations with your members, Ian?
Want to understand the way in which FDF membership is made up. So we have probably 20 of the 22, if you see what I mean. We have almost all of the top branded manufacturers, although we don't do beverage alcohol. So ironically, my former employers, Diageo, aren't members, although right now they feel like they are. But we have quite a lot of our members providing childcare for their workers, so as to take pressure off the public sector. I think the situation in London is a little bit different, but out in the rest of England, attendance at schools from key worker children is lower than 2%. So the issue is the other way round, in fact, in some places, about not whether kids can get into schools, but whether it's economic in any way to keep the schools running with so few pupils. But I think there is a bit of an opportunity, if this looks like it's going on for quite a long time, to try and find a way in which, and I'm not offering this at this stage, but we might come to it, where big companies in one particular geographical location where they're working might be able to offer help to other key workers' kids in childcare situations. I don't know if I know of one or two places where a big company might be the major employer in a small town, where they're offering workplace childcare and others can access that. And I'm hoping that we might, if this is going to go on a long time, find other ways of making that work elsewhere.
Well, that sounds like another very sensible example of the new collaborations that may arise from this. Now, perhaps moving on from some of these policy issues back to some of the practical challenges, as Wilda's described, of a contracting workforce with lots of pressures on it. And I think we're going to bring up a slide on screen from Techni-K on managing with limited human resource. I wonder, Barbara, whether you could sort of talk us through some of the ideas that you're sharing with your network and clients. I think it's on screen. So, Barbara, if you can, I think we're struggling to hear you, Barbara, at the moment. So I'm hoping that our studio can bring you in and ensure that you're going out to our webcast viewers. Now, I think we'll let's get Barbara sort of going out to live, and we'll take the slide down. So I think Barbara knows what her advice note looks like. Fire away, Barbara. We're still not hearing you, Barbara, which is very, very strange. So whilst we explore those audio challenges,
I was on mute.
You're back.
I'm back again.
Fantastic.
Yes.
I think that's
Sorry, I muted myself.
the mute gremlin has been I think affecting lots of video conferencing over the past few weeks. But by the I don't know, we need a sort of an alarm signal or sort of light, don't we, in the corner of our screens. Anyway, you're back live with us, which is fantastic. So if you can talk us through this briefing note, that'd be wonderful. Barbara.
So yes, as a Techni-K team, we looked a few weeks ago at how we could help businesses manage what was going to be coming down the line, because obviously 2 weeks ago when the lockdown was announced, everybody or most people were still fit and well. So it was about looking forward and saying what will happen as people do start to get sick. So it was about finding ways of prioritising and grouping people so that you could keep going in the business as long as possible. So first of all was to identify key roles and then group staff members for each role. And like Wilda said, anybody who's over 70 or who's got existing medical conditions to be asked not to work, they're in the highest risk category. And then categorising the remaining staff in order of age and health. So remember at the time, this is when we were told that it was mainly going to be affecting people who are older adults. Obviously, since then, we're starting to realise that it can also be difficult for young people as well. But at the moment, with the evidence that we've got, the categorisation in order of age and health is the best information that we're going to work with. And once you've categorised everybody, you pick the youngest and the healthiest members to take the key roles, and they work until they show signs of symptoms. And then the remaining staff members of that key role group should stay at home or work from home until needed. So you keep doing this. So when the next first staff member shows symptoms, again, they self-isolate, and then you keep going down the group until you've cycled through the process. In theory, depending on the size of your team, you shouldn't run out of people, because as people are getting better, obviously they're coming back to work. So that was the whole process around cycling people and making sure that you pick the people who are the fittest and strongest, but also don't put everybody on shift at the same time, so that you're reducing the risk of people picking up the virus from each other.
That sounds like really sensible, practical advice there, Barbara. Thank you. Now I'm going to turn to my colleague Pim, just to hear whether we've had any questions sort of coming in by email or YouTube, or indeed whether Pim has a question that she's burning to ask the panel. Pim.
We've had a question from Martin Kidd from Seagrow by email, and it's for Wilda. And he says, have Dina Foods tried to lobby their local MP or councillors to get the business rates relief extended, as they are supplying food to the retail trade who are now exempt from rates?
At present, we haven't actually lobbied our local ward members or our MP, actually. So I am grateful for that suggestion. I think the reality with coronavirus is that it has consumed our day-to-day life. When you're operations-based, you're very much on the ground and having to deal with the day-to-day issues. So it's left less time to be able to do something like this. But that is certainly a valued suggestion. I will definitely be picking that up as well. I mean, on the government advice on business rates, initially we assumed that it would cover most organisations that fell below the 51,000 threshold. However, as the advice was sort of evolved over time, obviously it narrowed down the scope to hospitality, retail, industry, and so we didn't fit that category. And I think I would really appreciate if the government could look into that a bit more and maybe increase the threshold for other businesses in the UK, especially where we're manufacturing food to have it supplied on the shelves, essentially.
Now, when we've looked across our 7 northwest London boroughs at their sort of current advice and approach to business rates, the one borough that I have to say really stands out for their approach is Barnet, where they're allowing any business to defer their business rates payment initially until the end of June, which could clearly be helpful. It may be that needs to extend further, but that seems to be an idea worth sharing, and one that will be encouraging other local authorities in West London to take a look at. So thank you for that question, and indeed your reflections there, Wilda. Now, I think really important, of course, for the entire food sector are the challenges of food hygiene, and we're going to bring up another sort of slide with I think some of the government's sort of current steers. But I wonder, Barbara, whether you could just share with us, I suppose, what you feel are some of the top priorities for food businesses, and how they can protect employees, maybe customers too, from the virus. Barbara.
Hi. Going back to what I said earlier, the food industry is very well set up for hygiene practices, because we're constantly telling and retraining employees about the benefits of hand washing and make it mandatory. So I think that stands us already in good stead. And I had a comment from one colleague a couple of days ago saying he doesn't have to worry about telling people to wash their hands now. They do it automatically. It's always been one of those things that we focused on, making sure that people do it. But I think the worry now is making sure that everybody's got enough supplies of soap and sanitizer to be able to continue doing that. But it's important to ensure that people are washing hands properly. I think there's been a little bit of concern that there are other things that people should be doing to keep clean and hygienic, but the important thing is to make sure that people are wetting their hands, rubbing through the soap across their hands, turning them round into the fingers, round the thumbs, and getting them properly clean, and that is enough. This hand sanitizer, it's helpful, but it's not the be all and end all. It's really hand washing with soap that stops the virus spread. Social distancing in factories, Ian alluded to it earlier, and not every factory is set up to have a couple of meters space between everybody. So what we're seeing now is people putting lines around, they're putting screens to help manage that better, and also within canteens, staggering the way that production is done so that not everyone's coming out for break at key times and there's enough space, or letting people go outside for breaks and having that time so that they can at least be in a space away from each other, because this is all about reducing the likelihood of transmission. First of all, we're saying people shouldn't be coming to work if they have got symptoms, but once they're there, it's making sure that you're keeping that space and reducing the ability for the virus to be transmitted in any way, shape or form.
Important points there, and I suppose that you highlight social distancing in a production centre context, which would seem to me, in Park Royal of all places, where everything is so tightly packed because we're so short of space, to be particularly challenging for our member businesses. Wilda, I wonder whether you can give a flavour of how you're kind of translating these ideas and guidance into practice on the ground.
Certainly. Over the last few weeks, as I mentioned, we've had to evolve our sort of approach to this virus. So initially, I mean, as a business, as Barbara highlighted, food industry, we already take our food safety extremely seriously. So hand washing was part of our day-to-day life. However, what we've done is increase the sanitization equipment around the building. So for example, as soon as you enter, we're asking staff to sanitize and then proceed into the staff room to change into their PPE, etc. And we've put the sanitization equipment around the offices, at all entrances, etc. We've increased the number of posters around the building, just alerting staff about the virus and asking them not to come in if they've got any cold or flu symptoms. However, we've had to adapt it over the last few weeks as well. So where we used to have questionnaires saying if you've been abroad, to an affected country, you're not to showing symptoms, then please don't come in. Obviously now that's sort of bit void essentially, because we're saying to all our visitors, no visitors on site unless you're an urgent contractor that needs to come in. So we've limited that. We've also introduced temperature checks for all our staff. So when they come in, first thing we do is take their temperature, make sure that they don't have an elevated temperature. Anything above 37.4, they're asked to go home. And touch wood, we haven't had that yet, but it's a measure we've introduced to try and catch staff quite early on if possible. We've increased the disinfection around the site. Already cleanliness is our priority anyway, but it's about sort of making sure telephones, handles, all these sort of common parts are being disinfected daily throughout the day as well, to try and limit that as much as possible. We introduced quite early on, actually a couple of weeks ago, we gave all our staff letters on letterhead paper confirming that they work for Dina Foods. We anticipated, we could see what was happening across the world with the lockdowns, and we anticipated that it would be happening in the UK. And so with issuing these letters, we asked them to carry them with them. So if they're traveling to work and they're stopped by the police, that they can produce this letter to verify that they're coming in to manufacture, which is obviously a key line industry. So that's something we did very, very early on. And just reinforcing the social distancing as much as possible. We've staggered break times to allow for staff to maintain that 2 meters as much as possible. And largely we can implement that on the production floor. However, there are areas where it's really difficult to, because they're packing bread and the practicalities of that are just quite challenging. So in anticipation of the evolving circumstances, we asked our staff to wear masks in those areas. And obviously we recognise that there's been a delay in the lead time in being able to order these additional masks. And the government advice, as was mentioned earlier, isn't wholly clear, but we're trying to do what we can on a practical level in order to have the social distancing and have the protection that the staff needs in order to comfort them and keep morale as high as possible on the production floor.
Really interesting, and you touch upon there the issue of supplies, because it's great in theory, but if you can't actually access the resources, difficult to put into practice on the ground. Barbara, I wonder what you're sort of picking up from your network and clients around that supply of PPE and hand sanitizer sort of issue. Barbara.
Well, I had one or two clients who were... Can you hear me?
We can. Yes.
Brilliant. I had one or two clients early on who were really very good and a bit like Wilda, forward thinking and making sure that they ordered everything back in February when supplies are still available. But then you always get people who are sort of behind the curve and trying to put their orders in. And I have heard that the major organisations that do the cleaning products have been able to keep supplies going, but not everybody is big enough. If you're not a large scale food manufacturer, you wouldn't have necessarily an order into some of the key manufacturers, so you're reliant on the kind of middle managers, the middle men, so to speak, who have got warehouses and wholesalers aggregating that and sending that out to you. And I think that's where some companies are starting to come unstuck. They've got stock now, but we realise that they're going to run out. And what I'm hearing within the industry is that because the government has bought up a lot of the stocks of soap and sanitizer to ring fence it for the NHS, that supply is slowing down to the food sector. But on the flip side, there are new companies coming on stream. I think some of the perfumeries are now starting to make sanitizer. So from a government point of view, that will take pressure off that side, which will then start to release product back to the food companies in the next. So that is purely anecdotal. I have got that
perfumeries, but also our distilleries are turning to hand sanitizer too. So it's amazing how businesses can adapt and rise to these challenges of our time. So lots of useful tips there on I think the food hygiene and sort of practice front. I think finally it would be really good to get some insights from you all on the supply chain challenge. And I wonder, Ian, whether you can share what you're sort of picking up, particularly from businesses with supply chains that extend outside the UK. Ian.
Sure. If I could just make one point on the hygiene point, or 2 points actually. One is that I agree. My perspective is that hand sanitizer supplies should ease over the next week as these new companies that Barbara mentioned come on stream. And certainly Ineos, the massive chemicals company, has turned quite a big part of its production that was otherwise stilled into hand sanitizer. Similarly, on protective equipment and particularly masks, one of the problems has been that most of that stuff comes from China, and China was closed. So as China reopens, the supplies should get better. And certainly we've heard from a couple of our members that supplies that they couldn't get at all 2 or 3 weeks ago have begun to at least be available to order, though they're not here yet. And the last point, I was just going to make one which I don't think I've heard, and somebody made this point to me yesterday, which is counterintuitive but important. It is really important that people use the social distancing guidelines in smoking areas. There's a bit of an assumption apparently that once you're outside with a ciggy, you are somehow, because you're inhaling nicotine, you're somehow immune from inhaling the virus. And actually, apparently, it's quite a hot spot. So, and I know we don't want to encourage people smoking, but if they are going outside, we need to make sure at some ironic level they do so safely. Back to your supply point, we're hearing mostly that supply chains are doing well, actually. Now we may be getting an unrepresentative picture, but our impression is that supply chains from Europe are remarkably robust. 1 or 2 problems with drivers, particularly Romanian drivers who can't get back into their country because they have to quarantine for 14 days. And so there's some driver shortages. 1 or 2 problems emerging in ports in terms of paper versions of certificates being required rather than e-versions. And we're working on that. I had a call yesterday with Greg Hands, the trade minister, asking him to get involved in that and sort that out. And he's promised to do that this morning so that e-versions are allowed. But so far, we have seen relatively little and much less than I would have expected disruption to geographical supply chains. And even Italian-based supply chains seem to be holding up in a way that is remarkable.
Well, that's good to hear. Give us some peace of mind. We'll be able to sleep at night. But I wonder, for an alternative perspective, Wilda, I understand most of your supplies are obtained from within the UK. What sort of supply chain pressures or not have you been seeing?
Fortunately, we're in the situation where we sort of predicted what was going to happen. So we ensured we had enough stock to see us through the next couple of months. And our suppliers, as they are mostly in the UK, have genuinely been very good at meeting the demand that we've had in the surge, especially in the bakery. So in that element, it's quite good. We are in constant contact with our suppliers, asking for regular updates from their end. And so far, we don't foresee a problem with the UK suppliers. We are getting some conflicting advice, though, from one local borough, quite local to us, about businesses, like sort of warehouses, essentially, that stock raw materials and distribute around the UK. Apparently, they've been asked, and these are different organisations, to close down by this local authority because, quote, they're not essential business. Now, right now, that doesn't concern us too much because we have enough stock, as I said, for the next couple of months. However, we don't know how long this lockdown is going to last for, and the authenticity of that advice. And because it is 2 different distributors, we are minded to believe it, to be honest with you. And that causes us some concern. They source the material outside of the UK. And if they can't open their warehouse to distribute to us, then that might pose a problem. So what we're doing is now looking at alternative agents and suppliers that are accredited, that hopefully will be able to supply us in the event that this goes on for longer than the 2 months.
Well, that sounds like a case study that Ian and I need to be picking up with you offline to raise with our local authority partners and try and get that problem solved. Well, goodness, we've covered an awful lot of ground in the past hour. I must get in a plug before we end the programme for a wonderful video that Techni-K have produced, an explainer video, which can be used by food businesses to help explain coronavirus to your staff. It's all visual, no audio, so really good for playing in the canteen. And it's also a resource that Techni-K are creating and have created in a number of different languages, including English, Polish and Romanian, which should make it doubly useful. So to access that, just go to their website. We've got the link there on screen. We'll include it in the final on-demand version of the webcast with a sort of click-through link underneath, so you can fill out the form on their website and get instant access. Now, I realise I haven't gone back to Pim, and I must. I think for a final question to our panel, just when they thought they got off lightly, I'm hoping that Pim has got a challenging program question from viewers, or indeed just something that Pim has been scratching a head about as the conversation's gone on. So, Pim.
Question for Ian and Barbara. Having listened to what Wilda was saying earlier, what has your advice been for businesses whose staff are feeling very anxious about coming into work?
Barbara, what's your thoughts on that anxiety issue?
Going back to what I said at the top of the programme, it was about the communication and making sure that you've got regular communication with people, answering their questions. So it's not about telling them that what they're doing is right or wrong. It's about reassuring and giving them information and taking the emotion out of the situation. So if they're anxious about going to work, what is it that's making them anxious? Is it that they think they don't have the right PPE? Is it that they think that their working lines are too close to another person? And it's about having those conversations and making sure you maintain the lines of communication open in both directions, just to reduce the level of anxiety, because it's normal in a situation like this for people to be anxious, but it needs time and it needs persistent and consistent messaging to help get the message across to people.
Absolutely. And Ian, do you have a top tip on that challenge of anxiety to share?
Well, I think it's entirely rational to be anxious, actually. I mean, I'm anxious. I'm 62. I've been working for over 40 years, and this is the scariest time I can remember. And the point about it, I think, is that it is unremitting, that this is not a particular threat. I remember very well 9/11 and being very concerned and apprehensive about going to work in London on 12/9, on the 12th of September, because I thought it might happen in London, where I was working right in the middle, to us. And of course it didn't. But as the days went, it moved away. But even somebody as experienced as me didn't go on the tube for 2 years. And I think that's an entirely rational reaction. I think you just have to try and, as Barbara said, take the emotion out of it, make clear that you're doing everything that you can to minimize the risks, and just help people through this. This is a very, very scary time. And the great thing about, the one thing that will work, I think, is people's sense of community. I'm amazed at the way the social distancing thing has happened. I'm astonished at the fact that people have stayed in their homes. I'm amazed also that people have gone to work where they need to. And I think, that is all a tribute to people's willingness to put aside their fears. But we shouldn't forget that those fears are grounded in not an unreasonable level of concern.
Indeed. It's inspiring times as well as tough times. And Wilda, sort of final reflection on that anxiety piece and your message to staff.
At the end of the day, this is a highly stressful situation, and we all go to work with the stress of knowing that we've left loved ones at home, and we fear for them. And taking the emotion aside, we have to just carry on reinforcing the guidance that's being issued as much as possible. And from my point of view, as a project director and GM, I just want to keep that morale up as much as possible on that production floor, because they are genuinely very scared, and we're all scared, to be honest with you. But the way we've approached it is, this is a war, essentially, and we need to do our duty and meet those orders and put the bread on the shelves, because that's what our clients want and that's what the public wants from us, and we need to carry on with that duty, essentially. So it's been so good to see sort of that younger generation step up, take on those responsibilities, and keep coming into work and keep working hard for the company. And we really, really value that. And I can't underestimate that enough. I can't. It's so reassuring to see that positivity on the workforce.
Wise words, Wilda. And I think as our hour is up, a good place for us to end. Thank you, as always, to our production team, Pim and Janelle at West London Business, and Joel at Revolution Audio. Thank you to my panel, Ian Wright, CEO of the Food and Drink Federation, Wilda Haddad, Project Director at Dina Foods, and Barbara Bray MBE, Associate Consultant at Techni-K. As always, continue to share your thoughts with us. We're going to bring up on screen shortly a link that you can follow to help steer our work in the weeks ahead at West London Business, and visit our microsite, coronavirus.westlondon.com, for the latest information and advice. If you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, please click on the button below the video stream to stay informed and show your support for our work. And of course, please join me and my panel of guests next Tuesday for Talk at 10, when we will explore the ways in which your business might be able to support the local community during the coronavirus pandemic. Until then, ensure your friends, family and colleagues stay safe and stay at home unless you're an essential worker. Thank you.